automatic. No. Automatic.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We're back for another one of our monthly webinars. Today, we're on the golf engineering side, going to be focusing specifically on in-season versus out-of-season training. I think I just want to come on again and talk for a couple minutes. For those of us, I guess, first off, that are fortunate enough to have an off season, which we are in Canada and a lot of other northern countries, I really actually kind of look at it as an advantage over being in some of the southern climates, because it really gives us a chance to shift up the way that we're working with people and do a deep dive into some technical improvements. It's so tough when people are constantly playing golf that you're trying to make these changes and then they go back out on the course and revert one step forward, one step back, sometimes two steps back, sometimes three steps forward. And so one of the other things too, I think is important, is if you are in one of those climates, like I see we've got a couple of guys from our Southeast Asian team on here right now, is to artificially create an off season. And, that's even one of the things I've had to do down here in Louisiana as well. And, the way I would recommend that you start by doing that is, when you're dealing with a client and you're going through some of the early stages planning, understand like what is their marquee event. So typically in the club golfer world, that's either going to be club championship or member guest. Those tend to be the two biggest events, obviously one individual, one more social team. And then I would recommend that in your annual plan, you budget to have a minimum of 3, ideally 4 months after that, where it's not necessarily that people don't have to play. If you could reduce the frequency of their playing, that would be advantageous. But even just to go through and, set the expectation that this is technical skill development time. And, we're going to focus more on an aspect of club delivery or body movement than we are on the end result of your scorecard. One of the other things you can do when they are on course, you try and change up the way the player is evaluating themselves, right? So whatever it is for them, I'll give you an example of something that would be relevant from someone who's like in a shot shaper type training program. Instead of having them count the total number of strokes that they take, go through and have them count the number of times they have the ball start right of their target, draw back to the left, but not cross the target line, right? And that can help to alter their focus and, again, really help that skill transferal. I think that was kind of all I wanted to do for a prelude, Carson. Hopefully that kind of sets the table a little bit for a few of the topics you're going to be going over. What do you have in store for us today?
Yeah, so the big thing we're going to go through today is the difference between coaching versus training. And that's where we talk about on-season versus off-season. So I'm just going to share you guys, share our slideshow with you. There. And we're going to get right into the difference between like coaching versus training. Oh, feedback from me or you? Oh, there we go. And we're going to start kind of talking about the difference between like function versus form. So function would be more of like how things are happening, and then the form would be like, function is more why things happen, form is how they happen. So we'll kind of dive into that more as we get into it. But the main thing is we want to make sure that a lot of coaching and a lot of training or teaching focuses a lot on the form and not as much on the function. But I think there's a right time to focus on one and the other. And that's where we have, like in Canada, we've got the off-season versus on-season. I mean, great coaches can communicate how the form will change the function. And that's how we kind of build or start the building blocks for when they have to play. Now, as we get into it, like coaching refers to a method of training, counseling, or instructing an individual or group how to develop skills to enhance their productivity or overcome a performance problem. Now, a big reason why we do coaching versus training is the big thing is we don't want players to get worse after a session with you, right? When you go into the technical aspects of coaching or training, a lot of people say, oh, I took some lessons and I got really, really bad or got worse after my training with my coach or with my lessons, and I stopped playing. I gave up. I stopped going to the coach because I couldn't figure it out, and my scores got really bad, right? So the whole idea of coaching is that we're helping them work with what they have, but help to understand how to make the shots functional on the golf course. So when we create like workstations, right, on the driving range when we're in season, our stations are focused on what the ball does, how the ball flies. So when we set up noodles or sticks, the sticks are to promote the right ball flight that we're after, so the desired ball flight. So as Liam said, if you're someone like in a shot shaper trying to hit fades, we'll set up sticks and we'll make shot shaper walls so to make them start the ball left of the target, right? So that they can start to fade it, work that left to right, and we'll give them points first on start line and curvature, right? And then we put more boundaries into like, okay, now we want it to start in this window. So we'll add another stick in so they get better at controlling where that ball starts. So it's more about understanding how to make things work than it is about the technical aspects to change their golf swing. So when we talk about the things, it's all tactical. So tactical means ball flight laws, setup, shot selection, diagnosis, and how to practice. These are kind of the main components we work on in season. Now, as we start to dive into each of these things, we start to go through, okay, for ball flight laws, right? We want the players to understand what affects the ball flight. So we want them to understand the important metrics like club path, face angle, lie, and even impact point, right? So when you work with launch monitors, I think the big thing that a lot of coaches don't do a great job of is hiding information, right? I think a lot of students can get overwhelmed with a lot of data. So if you're working with a launch monitor, put the things that they're working on the screen. So if I'm working on shot shape, I'm only leaving two things on the screen for them: club path and face angle, right? Or I may do launch direction and spin axis, right? So you get them to understand the fundamentals behind the ball flight, right? And they'll learn to create the conditions to hit the right shot, right? Then we'll get more into setup, right? So with setup, they'll start to learn like, how do you create the condition to hit a draw or hit a fade, right? Less technical work, but more static changes so they can functionally just go out and play golf in a good way, right? Less form, more function, right? How does ball position or alignment play into this for them to get the ball started and flying the right way, right? The more you can do with setup, right, the easier it is for someone to just take that change and play golf right away and start to control their golf ball better, right? Versus trying to try a new technique while they play golf. And that's where like you take the 2 steps back and 1 step forward kind of thing. We don't want that in season, right? We always want golfers to have the 2 different, say, modes of when they train. And like as Liam said, if they don't have an off season, create one for them, right? Where you can start to dive into the deep training. But when they're getting ready for events and tournaments, we don't want to start to implement technical changes to them because that will just change their timing, their delivery, their ball flight, and it's hard to play golf like that. We'll also get into stuff like shot selection, carry versus total, right? As most of you coaches know, we care a lot more about the carry than we do about the total, right? How do the players know their carry, right? Because that's going to help them score on the golf course. And we'll talk about draws versus fades, right? Can we use different shots to control distance, right? I know for a lot of players, if their desired shot shape is a draw, I love for a lot of players to hit fades to take a little bit of yardage off, because we do find a lot of players struggle with those, like not the 3/4 swings or in between clubs. So for a lot of those players, telling them to hit a fade actually just reduces their distance because the ball spins a little bit more, tends to launch a little bit higher. So it takes a little bit of yardage off for them. So it helps them hit those in between yardages versus their full carry distance from their normal shot shape, right? So being able to get people to understand why or how to use these different shots to actually control their ball is actually very important, right? And then, of course, with draws and fades, you can always talk about like what the hole requires, right? If the hole requires you to hit a fade into a shot, into a pin, but the fade typically going to be a little bit shorter than their normal club, hey, that may mean they have to use an extra club, right? So when we start to do their gapping sessions, especially with the better players, I actually like them doing one whole set with the draw, and then they'll go through a whole gapping session hitting fades. So you get two different carry distances for two different shot shapes, right? So that makes a player a lot more lethal when they're on the golf course, knowing their different yardages for different shot shapes, right? Versus just knowing their stock yardage. The next big thing that I like that are very important with players in season, shot diagnosis. So that means like when they hit a shot, can they diagnose what happened? Do they know where they hit the ball, impact location? What was good about the shot? What was bad about the shot? Can they explain to me, was it a face issue or a path issue, right? Was it a lie issue, right? And then can they bring the right intervention into play? Right? I think this is the difference between the good players and the high handicap players, is being able to diagnose their shots after they've hit a ball, right? Because what that does is if you can have a good diagnosis of why the ball flew the way that it did, you can actually learn how to implement the right interventions so the next shot is better. A lot of players self-diagnose improperly, so then they have the wrong intervention, or they're just starting to throw darts at the wall and hope that they get the right thing right? And that's where the players start to spiral and they get a big stretch of bad holes, right? Because they don't have the right interventions in place, or they don't know what to expect to see on the bad swings. Okay, so your job as the coach is to help them understand, well, when this goes wrong, this is what happens, and here's the right intervention for it, right? Players will typically have that miss, but when they understand why they block it out to the right, was it more of a face thing, or was the path not big enough? Then they can implement the right interventions. The next shot is better, and they don't do the same thing over and over again. When it comes to practice, right, I think there's a proper way to practice for in-season versus off-season, right? I mean, there's always a time for some block practice in season, but when we're doing a coaching session, we typically want to do a lot more random practice, meaning yardages are always different, targets are always changing. So you don't get to hit the same shot over and over again with the same club, right? If we're working on shaping the ball with a fade or a draw, have them change clubs every swing or every other swing, right? So this way they're always implementing some sort of randomness to their practice. They don't get to just pound driver over and over again until they get it right? Let them, unfortunately, the game of golf, you don't hit the same club twice in a row, very rarely. So they should practice like they will play, right? And that's the difference between in-season and off-season practice. We want them to train like they're going to play. Now we get into training. So this is more off-season. So training is the action of teaching a person or an animal a particular skill or type of behavior. So what does this include? It includes changing the desired shot shape, angle of attack, increasing power, technical changes, or ball striking, right? These are all skills that can be learned through training. And these are typically movement pattern changes, right? Changes are done in the off season to ensure there's no drop off in performance during the season, right? It's always, if you are blessed with an off season, on season, of course, right? You always hear that whole thing about players getting worse before they get better, right? And typically people will tend to struggle at the beginning when they're making technical changes with their golf game. So that's why it's better to separate the seasons for an off season versus on season, right? Because then if their focus is on making movement pattern changes, the score focus is now out, right? Now they're more focused on improving to get ready for the next year and the next big event. And they can implement those changes in time so that they're solidified by the time of their important events, right? So when we build workstations for training people or training program golfers, their workstations are to promote movement changes. So that means we'll put the alignment sticks around the person so that if they make the wrong movement or incorrect movement, they'll get some feedback. They'll hit a stick or they'll hit an object, so they know their movements are incorrect or not what's desired. When we look at off-season coaching, typically we're looking at the technical changes. So things like club path, dynamic loft, face angle, angle of attack. And typically these are all going to be things that we do with motor pattern changes. So kinematic sequence or ground reaction force, right? So we're looking at how to make movement changes to the golfer so they can implement new changes, right? So as we kind of get into like how to make motor pattern changes, a lot of that's going to be like different forms of training. So with a motor pattern change, like typically there's kind of two big ways to implement change, right? I mean, I do love slow motion swings, right? I mean, but the two big ways to change something is through chunking or sandwiching. Now, chunking, what that means is breaking up big movements into smaller movements. So typically I want like 2 or 3, 4 max, right, for movements. And this is for them to learn the new movement, right? So when it comes to chunking, what I mean is like if you're working on, say, shallowing the club at the top, I want a position for, so address, but then I want position 1 to get to the top of the swing. Position 2 is going to be, well, if they're going to shallow the club, it's going to be rotate and shallow. 3, we can take it right to impact, and then 4 can be finish, right? But then you can get different key points of the golf swing that we want to work on and learn how to get to. So we can go, say, get the player to 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can walk them through it and see if they can get to each position, say, fluently, right? And then from there, like when you chunking, I like to move into slow motion swings. Can you make a slow motion golf swing where they hit the different checkpoints that they worked on? So it becomes one fluid motion, right? Working in progressions from slow to fast will help them continue to build on those movements and get away from the chunking, right? So a lot of golfers, what you'll see is when they go through chunking, yeah, they can find the positions when they stop, have the time to think about how to get to the next position, right? So when you get into slow motion, I would say like the first progression is like, can you make a 40-second swing? Right? If anyone tries that, a 40-second swing is a very slow golf swing. But what you'll start to notice as a coach is that players tend to speed up through their trouble areas, right? I mean, I can ask you guys to all try this with your golfers and then your next session, but have them go through a slow motion swing. And whatever you're working on, I can guarantee you anywhere that a player feels uncomfortable, they speed up. And you'll see them go right through that position very quickly just because they're not sure what to do, so they kind of speed right through it. So when you move into those from chunks to slow motion, make sure they keep it slow. And you can go from a 40-second swing to a 30-second swing to a 20-second swing to a 10-second swing. And then you can start to kind of implement, you can implement golf balls into that, but I say, hey, let them know, like, I'm not expecting you to hit it far. I just want you to go through the motion with a ball in the way. And then you can start to go into, okay, now I want you to hit balls at 50% speed. And then gradually build their way up by 10% at a time until they get to full. But as a coach, you want to make sure, are they maintaining those same movement patterns? Or when they get to, say, 70%, they start to lose it, right? We want to see typically a 70% pass rate before they start to increase their speed, right? Or even higher. So typically I'll get players to hit 5 shots in a row. If they're successful 4 out of 5, I'll let them move up, right? If they're successful 3 out of 5, I say, okay, they can stay. If they're only successful 2 out of 5, they got to slow back down. So they will take them down a notch. And we'll start to work them through that. Can they get all the way up to full speed? Most people can't on their first session, but they start to figure out what their threshold is before they start to lose the movements, right? So what we want to do is get the player's body moving in a different pattern than they're used to, so that their brain starts to understand the movement patterns that they're trying to accomplish versus their own. And then I'll implement something called sandwiching. So sandwiching is making the correct movement, but then you follow it with an incorrect movement. and then you bring back the correct movement. So you go from good, bad, good. So again, if I use the transition as an example, someone's trying to shallow it, I'll have the person go through it nice and slow and go through a rehearsal with the good motion. Then I'll go have them say, okay, do your normal swing, right? Where they kind of come over the top. And say, go back to the good. So then the player starts to feel and identify the difference between the correct movement and the incorrect movement, right? So they're starting to develop the feel between the two so they can differentiate the two. As a lot of you coaches will know that when you work with a player, a lot of players don't know when they've changed something. They're like, yeah, it feels the same, right? So sandwiching technique actually brings the feel into play for the golfer. And so it helps them differentiate the goods and the bads. Sorry, I forgot to mention, if you guys do have questions, please feel free to throw it in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll answer that at the end, coming up shortly. The next piece. So kind of the key takeaways when working with in season versus off season. Make sure there's a clear delineation between coaching and training, right? So I think a big discussion when you have with a player is what they're trying to achieve, right? And then as a coach, you can work with them on, okay, here's what we're going to do for your training, and then here's what we do with your coaching. And you can set the timeline of when you want to do each part, right? So if someone doesn't have an off season, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere or down South where it's always warm, right? Work with the player to figure out when the right time is to make the technical changes, and then when they should be focusing on the function of the swing, right, versus the form. Kind of leading into that, we always want to say that players should always improve, right? So whether it's the coaching or the in-season or the off-season training, we want to make sure that someone's always moving forward with their swing or forward with their game, right? So that's why we want to delineate the two so that there's always some sort of improvement with the player. When you're doing coaching, when they're focusing on how to make the right shots happen and understanding ball flight, they can continue to improve because, again, they're understanding the ball and they can start to control where it's going and what to do. And then in the offseason, they're controlling the technical aspect. So you're working on a key performance indicator, or you're working on the metrics that you throw up there, whether it's club path or face angle or impact point. You can actually quantify improvement with technical changes, right? Or even if it's just a more efficient club delivery. So bigger carries or better smash, higher ball speed, whatever it is. For a lot of people, you may have to create an off season, right? So if you do need to create an off season, not a problem, right? Just work with the player to create that off season so you can delineate the two seasons for the player, right? So you have a goal in mind that you can get them to. Another thing is make sure you have two different practice types, right? Training program or training players that are working on form. It's more about block practice, right? So same club, going through workstations that will tell them whether or not they made the right movements, versus in-season workstations or that focus on ball flight, right? Or random practice, right? So constantly changing clubs, changing targets, changing lies, right? Get them hitting balls out of the fairway, out of the rough, if you're able to move around on turf, right? We want to be able to kind of have two different practice plans for golfers in the different seasons. And lastly is have the proper evaluations in place. So if someone is working on shot shaping, right, in season, we're going to just kind of figure out, okay, are they starting the ball left and fading it right? And we'll score them based on ball flight. But in the off season, when they're working on technical changes, we'll focus more on, did their club path get in the right position, or was their club path proper? Was their face angle proper? Was contact well, right? So having the right evaluations in place for the two different seasons is very important, right? I think if you start to kind of break it down for like, what's the difference between coaching and training? Coaching, typically we were more about the ball. Training is more about the body, right? I think that's the easiest way to kind of differentiate the two. Is like, are you focusing more on their movements and their body? That would be more training and off season. If you're focusing more on ball and output, that's more coaching, right? Or getting the ball to the hole, right? And that's kind of the key between the two, between off season and on season. I hope that helps you guys out. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to throw in the chat. Oh, Excel sheet. Where's Excel sheet, Johnny? Oh, there are a question. Perfect. Let me pull this up here. What do you think about online lessons? Okay. Well, I mean, I think with online lessons, like we've done some online lessons for sure. And I think, again, it really depends what the player's working on. Like and you can definitely help players improve with online lessons. And a lot of it, again, is like when you're doing these online lessons, I just again, sort out like, what's the player trying to achieve? Are they trying to improve their ball flight? Are they trying to improve their technique? Right. I think a big thing with online lessons, like if the player is able to have a launch monitor with them, so you can have data that you can see, right? I think the big thing is when you're working on technique, right, and form, online lessons are tougher if you don't have some sort of evaluation tool to be there, right? Because a lot of the cameras, when you're doing online lessons, they're not going to be fast enough to get a good picture, right, a good video. So when you're doing movements, like you can definitely do the chunking, you can do slow motion, and you can do the sandwiching drills. But as an evaluation form, it's tough to see, like when you ask them to hit a draw or hit a fade, and you're looking at club path, you definitely want some sort of evaluation with that, so to reassure that they're doing it right. I mean, the good news with an online lesson is they can get outside to do it. You can help them create the right workstations so that they can promote the right things, and you can make sure they're doing the right things. So honestly, I don't mind online lessons at all. Like we do them here at the lab, mostly in off season. Funny enough, we do online lessons when people are way down south. I'll have them create workstations at the dry range that they're at, and actually put their phone on a tripod and just do a Zoom link, and we'll do an online lesson through Zoom. So I definitely don't have a problem with online lessons at all. How would you schedule gym time versus golf practice in the off season compared to in season? That's a good one. So I think with off season training versus in season, and especially in the gym, I'd say the type of things they do in the gym will be different in off season versus off season. Scheduling, I would definitely want them to be a little bit lighter in season as well, so it doesn't hinder performance. I mean, in season, I typically want the gym to be more about maintenance than it is about getting stronger or faster, right? So stuff they do in the gym for in season, more about maintenance. Off season is where we can start to try to create more speed and strength, right? Because that's more technique, and we won't worry about them being sore. So we can definitely rev up the number of reps they go to the gym in the off season. That's all I would do in terms of change between off season and in season. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to training, I would just watch the number of reps and how they train. So definitely work with someone that's a TPI certified for that, to make sure that they are getting the right programs in place to promote what they're trying to do. Patrizio, when working on new stuff off season, how do you behave with feedback and tools? Working on new stuff off season, how do you behave with feedbacks and tools? 3D launch monitors. So with off season, when you're working on new stuff with the off season, I think again with like the 3D and launch monitors, I think the big thing is presenting the right data to the golfer. And what I mean by that is, like, don't give them too much information. If they're working on kinematic sequence, right, focus on the kinematic sequence. Like, are they trying to transition differently, right? So just show them what they need to know. Don't overwhelm them with body tilts and all that. It's one thing at a time. Right? I think it's very important to isolate what you're trying to work on and help the player understand why that's important, right? And then try to solidify one thing at a time. Don't try to rush them into 4 different things in the same session, because then they forget about the first thing, right? Solidify one thing at a time, then add pieces in, right? With launch monitors, big thing is, don't give too much information. If they're working on shot shaper, so club path and club face, only show them those 2 things, right? I mean, you can throw carry in if you're really worried about carry, and distance, but I definitely think less is more when working with technology. Right? I think a lot of people will get engulfed by all data and they just get overwhelmed. So keep it simple for your golfers. I think that's the big key when you using technology. Peter Bacon. Winter indoor training will be focused on the changes necessary for improved performance for the coming season. Would you agree? 100% I agree. So Peter, I think that was a great, I don't know if it's a statement or a question, but definitely indoor training is definitely to get everything in place for the upcoming season. So if we know that a player, we want to change some sort of behavior, we want to work on that in the off season so that they're getting ready so they can be better for the next season. So 100% I agree on that. And I love that. Dan, would you consider indoor training a better time to make a swing change? So yeah, 100%. I agree. That's exactly what we've been going over, is that indoor training is the time to make swing changes. I mean, the whole thing is we don't like seeing that 1 step forward, 2 step back type of approach during the season when they're playing golf, right? Because typically you'll see a lot of golfers try the new swing for 1 hole, they hit, or a couple of holes, they hit 1 bad shot, like, oh, I got to go back to my old swing. Then they ingrain their old swing again. So definitely indoors training is the better time to make swing changes, because you can hide information like ball flight and stuff from them, so they can just focus on club delivery. Brian, do you see any noticeable difference in players, angle of attack, shaft lean after time on mats? So that's an interesting one. So it's not so much that I see them with time on mats. I mean, I definitely see players that get too steep, I'll say more injury prone, and they'll make adjustments, right? So they learn to be less steep. I do notice there have been a couple players that struggle indoors in terms of the environment, feeling, I'll say, enclosed, right? Especially with the driver, where you see them swing the club differently with the driver indoors than they do outdoors. And that's typically more of a mental block. So I do see some performance changes in that sense. But angle of attack and shafting, I don't really see a big change from hitting on mats versus outdoors. I mean, I see more ball differences in terms of what the ball does off a mat, more than I will see with the angle of attack and shaft lean. And I think that's just more of the friction from a mat versus off turf. But yeah, it's different between a steeper player versus a shallow player, picker versus a digger. So I see more differences in ball flight than I will club delivery changes, funny enough. Lincoln, how to practice short game indoors. Okay. So, I mean, there's a couple different things for short game indoors. So, I mean, we'll start with wedge work. So with wedges, a lot with the indoor stuff with wedges, a lot of this, like learning how to create spin or impact location, using the bounce differently. I mean, what's interesting about indoors and I mean launch monitors is like we can start to teach players how to hit higher indoors, and we're a lot tighter with the tolerances indoors in terms of like dynamic loft, getting the right information with the launch monitor indoors in a controlled environment. And typically when we're doing short game indoors, it's more of technical changes, right? So we can use swing cat or video to make sure they're doing the right changes to the technique. I mean, The thing about mats or hitting indoors is that the ground is a little bit more forgiving, so the club will tend to bounce versus hitting chunk shots outdoors. But as a coach, you can still hear the difference between like a leading edge chunk versus one where they use the bounce, right? And if you know how to use your launch motors and have the right data in place, right, you can help quantify what a good swing is with a wedge for chipping, and you can teach them how to hit high, low, mid trajectory shots with their wedges, or control spin with contact point with your launch motors indoor, right? So we'll do a lot more of a small technical changes when it's indoor for chipping and wedge work, right? And a bigger thing with indoors, like when you're working on yardages, so controlling your shots, so like full, three-quarter, half shots, we'll do a lot of work with like loft control and speed control, right? So what you start to notice when you do short game, especially with like three-quarter and half shots with wedges, people are very consistent with their full swing speed. But as you go into like three-quarter and half, you start to see the standard deviation of their swing speed vary quite a bit, as well as their dynamic loft. So when we're working indoors, it's more about them learning how to control their loft and control their speed so they can be a lot more consistent with their distance control, right? So you can definitely help people indoors with short game and wedge work. With putting indoors, I mean, it just makes a more controlled environment than outdoors. I mean, depending on how big your putting surface is, obviously for us, our putting patio is 18 feet long. So we're restricted in terms of long putts. So we're doing a lot more technical work in the off season indoors. So more about their stroke, setup, aim, right? We do a lot of eye dominance, teaching them how to see straight. Funny enough, a lot of people have trouble seeing straight. And what I mean by seeing straight is if you ever put you line up a golf ball, the line of the ball to the hole, and then stand over the ball, and it looks left or looks right to you, right? What you can do is when we're indoor training putting, it's actually teaching people how to see straight, right? How to create the right head tilts to see the line straight. So when they stand over a ball and look from ball to hole, it actually looks straight to them, right? So we'll train more of technical work for eye dominance and seeing and vision. And then we'll also do technique as well with putting. So you can definitely do practicing indoors with people. It's just a different thing of what you do. I mean, when I go outdoor with putting, it's more about distance control, right? And reading greens than it is about technique, right? So again, it's like getting the ball to the hole versus form. How to be better playing in windy conditions. Oh, okay, that's an interesting one. So I think one big thing with playing in windy conditions is understanding what wind does to the golf ball, right? I mean, so it's kind of funny, like I'll choose shot shape with the driver based on the wind. So my natural shot shape is a little bit of a cut. So, and especially anytime I'm downwind, I'm hitting a high cut all day, right? Because the high cut's going to spin more, so it's going to stay in the air longer and get a lot more carry. And that wind's going to carry it to actually shallow the descent angle anyway, so I get a lot more distance out of it, right? Versus a draw, if I hit a draw downwind, my draws have a lot less spin on the ball. So the ball actually falls out of the air a lot earlier, and you start to see a lot more of those like sliding kind of almost hooks, right? So like, yeah, I'll try never to hit a draw downwind if I don't have to, because I typically don't get more carry out of a draw. However, with no wind, I'll hit a draw will actually go further for me, but I'm just more comfortable hitting fades. But into the wind, I'll always hit a draw because the lower spin, when you're hitting into the wind, kind of creates like a higher spin condition. It'll help keep the ball in the air, funny enough. But a lower spinning ball into the wind gets less affected by the wind because there's less drag. So you see more distance out of a lower spinning shot, right? So with players and their irons, it's like teach them how to take spin off of their iron shots, right? So less about playing and winning conditions, but understanding, again, this is more about understanding conditions is what can you do to take spin off a ball so that you can hit into the wind and not lose as much distance? Right? A lot of people will say hit a knockdown shot, but then you look at their club head speed, then their knockdown shots are 5 miles slower than their normal swing. So they do knock off some spin, but it's mostly because it's a speed deficit more so than it's a loft or de-lofting the golf club. Right. So it's teaching players how to swing a club and change their loft at delivery to knock spin off versus swinging slower to knock it down. Right. So, I mean, a lot of players tend to say, "Oh, just take an extra club and swing." Well, the taking the extra club goes further because it's typically the longer the club you go, the less loft there is, so less loft and less spin. Right. So teaching players how to de-loft their club through impact versus, I'll say, their traditional loft impact or dynamic loft will help them hit the ball further, right, without having to necessarily always go up a club, right? And understanding, like, do I hit the ball to hold against the wind or ride the wind with it, right? And that's more of a distance control thing, right? So holding a ball against the wind, typically you'll lose a little bit of distance, and being able to ride the wind down into your target, right? So it becomes more of like the coaching aspect of playing in windy conditions, more so than it is about always a technical thing, right? There's kind of two ways you can go about it. I hope that answers your question. Joelle, looking for winter golf improvement options. Okay, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by looking for winter golf improvement options, but typically what we say, like, in off-season training improvements, we kind of put them into different buckets. So one of them is basic fundamentals, right? So teaching people like grip, posture, stance, the basics of the swing, right? Stance width, right? I think that's a different form, right? Then we go into like solid contact, right? So making good contact, right? So I say the options would be break them into buckets. So it goes to basic fundamentals, solid contact, shot shaper, so controlling the golf ball, so left and like draws and fades, short game, and then power, right? Those are our 5 buckets that we use. Each bucket focuses on different things, right? So typically when you're doing basic fundamentals, it's grip, posture, stance, width, stuff like that. Solid contact is more about like ball speed, efficiency, impact point, right? Shot shaper is club path, club face, right? So it's being able to separate the different metrics that you can work on in the winter or the off season, so that they're in the right program and they can have a desirable goal that they're after for the sessions that you do, right? I think it's very important that you do separate each program into different buckets so that you don't get Mr. Whoever who comes in, oh, I taught my 3-wood on 18. Let's go. Can I work on my 3-wood today? No, right? Let's work on the technical changes or the fundamentals that will help you get there at the end, right? It's not random. This time we're doing bunkers. This time we're doing 3-wood. This time we're doing driver, right? Have a goal at the end of the road, right? This way you can always guide the person in the right direction, and you can help them reach their goal so they master something by the end of your program, right? Like our training programs are designed so that we set out a KPI or key performance indicator for the golfer, so that by the end of their sessions or the end of their program, they can achieve this skill. They have mastered this skill and they have it, and it's with them forever, right? And then we can move them into the next program of whatever it is, so that they can add a new skill. So it's one skill at a time. You're not trying to do everything all at once, right? I mean, a lot of you know, and you've worked with golfers, they can't handle a lot of information. So when you're trying to work on too many things all at once, nothing gets actually solidified. It gets better for a little bit, and then it goes away, right? We want to make permanent change to a golfer. We don't want things that come and go, right? So having something that puts people into buckets can help you get them to their end goal and help them retain the information when they're done your program. I think that's all the questions that we have. I don't see any more or new ones. So I hope I answered all your questions. If anyone has any questions going forward, please feel free to email myself or Johnny. Otherwise, I'll see you guys all in 2 weeks. Take care. We'll see you soon.